So, take a sip of coffee or a snort of cocaine if you must, but don't forget the lives of those at the other end of the supply chain. We go to Colombia tonight to hear from a young British man who's just back from 4 years working on a farm in the heart of the jungle. So now we go to hear from him now. And Martin, maybe you could just start. His name's Temas Teani. Give us a little brief introduction to Colombia, because this is somewhere where basically they have death squads, and yet they've got an image now. They've got a new president, an image that everything's going beautifully.
Well, you want me to talk about Colombia? Yes. I mean, basically, Colombia has been at war almost, well, certainly at war since the 1940s. You've got a leftist rebel movement, FARC, Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia. You've got an elected government, but there's not really genuine elections in Colombia, because if you are standing for radical parties, you end up being assassinated. But there is a peace process going on in Cuba, which is actually quite positive. And FARC are talking to the government in Colombia. It may turn into a peace process. Let's hope so.
OK, he was there for 4 years, back about 2 weeks ago, so let's hear now from Temas.
My name's Temas Teani, and I've been back in the country now for 12 days from Colombia, Latin America. I got attracted to the people there and a kind of a way of life that I felt was lost in this country.
But it's a drug country. I mean, what, are you going over there to get drugs or what?
See, a lot of people think that, and a lot of people have this idea that everyone there is in a kind of Pablo Escobar agenda. I went to Latin America before, and it was a country that I was scared to go to, that I had fear of going there because there's so many bad reports of what goes off in Colombia. But I met Colombians here in this country, and after meeting them, and the idea was not to go there and travel, but to go there and actually live in a certain place with certain Colombians. And so I wasn't attracted to Colombia, but it was with these people that I went there. And the reason why I went to this specific place in Colombia, which is where I've been staying for a while.
So you're working on a farm, we're living on a farm over here, and what's the difference between farming over there?
Well, one thing is definitely the laws and the freedom. For instance, this land is so overpopulated, and that there is so much production that there is no freedom here. You know, you cannot go onto a piece of land and build your house. You know, we do not have the right to live as our ancestors lived here. And there's a good reason, because it's very overpopulated here. But you go to Colombia and it's 5 times bigger, and there's 2/3 of the people. And so the majority of the land is nature, and the nature, I mean, here to come back and so many little pockets of woodland and nature all owned by the army, it's quite a shock. But over there, nature is the majority and humanity is the minority.
So what were you doing on the farm here, and what were you doing on the farm in Colombia?
Well, here I was learning about sustainability, about ecology, all those kind of green buzzwords, you could say, of where to go. And really the focus here was the kind of materialistic side of the environmental movement. For instance, you get the green movement, it's got ideas about renewable energy, about different things, and really, I mean, it's good what they say, it's a lot of information, but it deals with the kind of the aspect of materialism, how we can solve problems materially in this country. More about the way of life, like sort of the transition town, and I'm not knocking this in any way at all, it's a very good movement that's come up. But also, having gone over there and spoken to people that are more connected to the nature, the people that have not been taken out and put into this false environments that you get here, they understand the problem to be not just the type of batteries that you use or where the power source comes from, but actually the problem is more for them psychological and in the humanity and what they call here the kind of the paradigm that we have. And so I've been going there, and really what I've realised that by leaving here and going there, that the Latin Americans with their nature and with so little contamination that you have there, that they still have something in their psychology which is revolutionary, which really is something that has been so terribly lost in this country, because really we've lost the grassroots and we're losing the nature at such an enormous speed of knots. And the same with this fracking as well, that we are losing the very thing that connects us to the earth, and there they still have it.
What about the political situation in Colombia?
Yes, I mean, that situation has been going on for a long time, and even the most sort of famous moment was just after the Second World War in 1948, when they had, you could say, a runner for the presidency called George Gaitan. Basically had all the people behind him, like all the workers, the campesinos, the country folk were behind this man. and he would have gone in power, and he would have made the social changes necessary to have stopped Colombia being the imperialistic playground for the countries of the north. And he got assassinated, and the country went into riot, and from there started the guerrilla warfare movement, that a lot of people basically went off into nature, into the wild, to start fighting unconventional warfare against the government forces. In Cuba, they used the same tactics, but because Cuba is such a small island and because everyone was behind the forces, they achieved victory. The revolutionary there was Che Guevara, Fidel Castro. But because Colombia is so big, and because the control there through the army was already so well extended, that the guerrilla forces have not been able to achieve any kind of any achievement through their ideological means or things like this, or through that kind of warfare.
So what's the political situation now? Who's running the country?
Definitely not the person who's got the big nice smile on the TV screens. That the people that run the country now are the same people that run the country, you could say, 60 years ago, and that is big business. Because the big business own all the banana plantations, own all the coffee, or the big significant tracts of land where they have these places. United Fruit Company, and all these companies have been effective since the 40s and 50s. These companies and this system obviously has evolved, and it's become different names, different faces, different smiles, but it's the same tyranny there. It's the same forces that are basically controlling things today.
What about drugs? How have they come in? Cocaine. What's happening there? Because certainly the last I've heard, there was their sort of paramilitary side, which is representing the government, and the FARC guerrillas, both doing drug dealing, both having cocaine plantation.
That's right. Obviously, we all know of the name Pablo Escobar, who ended up being one of the most famous cocaine drug dealers there. And in no way at all am I promoting this drug at all, but what I want to say about Pablo Escobar that not many people know, the movement that he was connected with, they were growing coca and growing cocaine, because at the time that was like a viable product. Every farmer could have the right to grow coca to then make cocaine, and then got sold in the different cartels. There were cartels that were owned by the guerrillas that Pablo Escobar was connected to, and there were cartels that were owned by the government, and obviously had the same criminals such as Pablo Escobar, but obviously they were in bed with the government. And so in that sense there are many people like Pablo Escobar, but he was the one who was most prominent in the guerrilla and in the sort of anti-establishment. And so basically he got, when he got killed, in some ways turned into like almost a bit of a strange Robin Hood character in Colombia, because he was the one that was using the same system against itself to fight. But really, that was in the dream days of cocaine, you could say, because now all the cocaine is grown and protected by the mafia families that set up those paramilitary groups. And now that cocaine mafia, it's all for the super rich and all for the people in very high big business. They are stopping the cocaine from the smaller farmers that are probably going out more, slipping out the streets. And my understanding is that they want to keep that little precious commodity of theirs for themselves. And it's very interesting when we know where that commodity comes from and how it came to be, and whose land that is grown on.
So how do they get hold of the land to grow this cocaine on at the moment?
First we have to answer what happened to the old land that the coca was planted on, because there was a lot of old land. And obviously the US had their war on drugs, and they gave the Colombian government the chemical that is now in that Monsanto Roundup, glyphosate, is it? And this is what basically they dumped on massive tracts of the Colombian rainforest to take away the coca, but they also having to take away every single piece of life there, including the farmers, including everyone else, just as collateral damage on the war on drugs. And so there you have this amazing contamination in a very significant part energetically on the planet with this glyphosate, this very venom that they use in Roundup. And then at the same time you had paramilitary groups and death squads. I mean, that's the friendly term for them, that basically there have been enough reports there in Colombia, and enough stories, and enough people trying to come out and to get justice who speak about how these death squads have gone to communities, rural communities, and they have closed off whole villages and towns, and they have caused massacres. Not for any war, not for a war on drugs, not for guerrillas, but literally some young officer would be given a machete in hand or a chainsaw and given the order, cut off the arms of that woman, of that child or whatever, If you don't, we're going to cut off your arms. And so the people there, the paramilitary death squads, are tied up in a kind of, well, not even a kind of, in pure Satanism, you know, to put it bluntly. I know that shocks a lot of people to say that, but I can't think of any other expression to really sum up the kind of cruelty that the Colombian people, the campesino, the ordinary country folk of Colombia, have had to go through for so many years. There's a very hush-hush thing in the psychology of the people there. I had an English friend who went through a capital city and began asking someone on a bus, "Go on, what do you think of the government?" And the guy nodded, "Oh, see, yeah, it's okay." And he goes, "Yeah, but there's the death squads and there's this and that." And the guy waved his hand for him to come a bit closer and whispered to him and said, "You don't want to be saying these things here, we don't know who's listening." And he went quiet. This has been going on for 60 years, and the Colombian people, if you like, have had a certain amount of conditioning, a certain amount of fear drilled into them where they don't question it anymore, and it's just something they just take as, you know, how to say, just take as normality. This kind of changed when Hugo Chavez came into power in Venezuela, and you had Rafael Correa in Ecuador. The two neighbours to Colombia suddenly had these kind of socialist systems, and they've had to have a lot of fights in those systems themselves. But at that same time, because of that, they highlighted the corruption that was going on in Colombia to such a point that the Colombians themselves began to see it and began to question, well, why is it our neighbouring countries, they get people who look after them, where they get free education, they look after, you know, their own people, why can't we have this? And so the government and big business have now gone a different tactic. They've taken out the very bad son of the mafia death squad dictator, and they've put in a guy called Santos, which anyone knows in Spanish means holy or saints. And this man, Santos, has the public image of being someone reasonable, being a good person, a good guy. And really, if you go to the towns and if you go to the places that are being filled up very quickly in Colombia nowadays, if you go just by the town perspective of the situation in Colombia, that everything's going well, there's peace with the guerrilla forces, and this guy is doing great things, causing a lot of business, a lot of money to flourish in Colombia. To a certain extent, obviously there's a half-truth in that, because he is making a lot of business. There is peace with the guerrillas now, but we also know that the guerrilla forces have been, if you like a puppet show forces for the last kind of 5-7 years. And we know that because we got displaced, not by the Colombian government, I say we, the people who I went to visit over there, they were living in the jungle, and they got displaced not by the Colombian government, but by the guerrilla forces who are supposed to be looking after them. And so they came out of the jungle disillusioned with the guerrilla forces, and they knew that these guerrilla forces are no longer fighting for the people, that they're in some kind of macho commando Arnold Schwarzenegger kind of, mentality with the war there. And really the civil war lost its true revolutionary impulse and just became a token for the government that whenever they want to invade indigenous land, they just need to they just need to have a few bombs. Who knows how they get set off? And then they have the cause to go into this piece of land. We think the guerrillas are in that land over there, which just happens to have water, or that land there, which happens to have copper, or wherever. They go into these lands and kick the indigenous off. Every month or every few months you can go to the capital city, you can find new indigenous groups in Colombia lining the streets there. When I last came, it was the Imbera, which are in the middle of Colombia. Last time I went, it was Choco, which was in North Colombia. There's always new indigenous groups. I don't know what happens to these people after a few months, but they're there for a few months, and then there's a new load of indigenous groups come in to replace them. This is something that shocked me, because I thought the displacement of Indians and indigenous was something that happened in the 90s, 80s, and now it's getting a bit better, but it's happening more now than ever. More now than ever, because there's no armed resistance against it, and really there's no resistance at all, because there's very little land which have a big enough connection with Western society that can, put up a front or put up a resistance. That the only land that's left is really deep in the jungle, and, well, it's all up for sale anyway. So, Indians and all.
Martin, we heard there Temas Teani. He's saying also that the Chinese are moving in, buying up rivers and that kind of thing.
Well, the Chinese are trying to, get their deals done around the world, as is everybody else. I thought that was a pretty good summary of the situation in Colombia. I don't think they've actually finally cracked the peace process. As I understand it, there is still fighting going on, but there is enormous talking going. There's talks going on in Cuba. So, the ordinary people have suffered tremendously during this guerrilla war over 60 years, and it would be good to end it. But the slogan for ending it, I've been in Colombia. I was a Bristol Unison delegate in Colombia in 2005, and a lot of what I saw would certainly gel with what I heard there. But the slogan of the popular movement in Colombia is justice with peace. Peace with justice. So in other words, it's not just a question of putting our guns down and stopping fighting. There's got to be some justice as well. People have got to have access to land, they've got to have some rights, and as he mentioned, in both Venezuela and Ecuador, you've got sort of socialist governments which are in fact improving the lot of ordinary people, and ordinary Colombians are starting to say, well, why can't we have that? Uribe, who was the former president of Colombia, has incidentally been implicated in an attempt to overthrow the democratically elected government of Venezuela last week, and the Venezuelan government have exposed, they said all of these Colombian mercenaries were going to come to Venezuela to try and overthrow the Venezuelan government, but they were nipped in the bud. And Uribe, who also works for Hong Kong Shanghai Banking Corporation, like the former head of MI5, Jonathan Evans here, was implicated in that. It's basically justice and peace in Colombia are they're shimmering on the horizon. But I have to say, when I went to Colombia, I went to meet people from the trade unions and the social movement, and I went to meet courageous people, and I was not disappointed. They are fantastically courageous. They put up with all sorts of violence and repression, but their spirit of solidarity with each other and commitment to the truth is really humbling, and that's what I went to see, and that's what I went to meet those kind of people, and they were truly inspiring.
Well, one of the things he was talking about there was this whole concept of really the guerrilla uprising being completely dead, and but the guerrillas of certain sorts still being around, but they're more like, seemed to me, Martin, maybe more like these paramilitary organisations. He was saying that people are still being displaced. And one of the fascinating things he was saying there is that they're being actually displaced, Native Americans being displaced at a faster rate than ever now in Colombia.
Yes, well, the way they do it is they say, FARC are operating in this valley, so we're going to send the army in. The army then brutalise the locals run away, and hey presto, it just turns out this valley's got oil in it, and then an oil company turns up and starts drilling. British Petroleum has actually got a big field in Casanare in the south of Colombia, and about a decade ago now, an environmental regulator had placed a fine on BP for making a mess. He was assassinated by two guys on a motorbike, and the Colombia Solidarity Campaign suspects that those two guys were in fact British soldiers, serving British soldiers from the British SAS who carried out that assassination. Can't prove it, but that's the suspicion.
So what about the wider connections between the Western world and Colombia itself?
Well, Colombia interests me because it shows what is wrong with the West's vision for the future. And of course, ultimately, when you mention Colombia, people think about drugs immediately. It is now becoming very strongly pushed in all sections of Latin American society and all political forces to say we've got to legalise drugs, because otherwise we've got a situation where they just become a means of making money for terrorists, criminals, whoever. Auto Unidas Defensas de Colombia, which means the self-defence forces of Colombia, which came out of Uribe's activities, who is the ex-president. They are the right-wing paramilitaries, and of course what happens is, if you're a right-wing paramilitary working with the Colombian military and the US military, you are allowed to deal drugs in order to fund yourself, and they look the other way. If you are FARC, on the other hand, you get called drug dealers. What FARC generally used to do is they basically protected people who were growing coca, and then they sold them. They took a tax on it to fund their activities. FARC. I mean, this is one of the problems with all guerrilla activity. The guerrilla activity isolates you from others. If you go off into the jungle with your rifles and train, and the FARC were very, as guerrilla forces go, they're quite sort of regular. They've got uniforms, they've got officers. officers. You know, they look like an
But I
army.
mean, he's saying there that FARC is basically gone. There is nobody doing that job anymore.
No.
There's all these sort of fake versions.
That's not true. FARC are negotiating with Santos's government in Cuba. I mean, they could hardly negotiate with him if they didn't exist. They've taken a battering because the US and the British and others have been supporting the Colombian army to repress people. But the FARC have also got things to answer for, because what happens in wars actually is people start losing their marbles. The Taliban are killing lots of ordinary people in Afghanistan. It doesn't mean that people don't support them. It just means that it's a messy war, and you've got the same problem in Colombia.
Well, Kay Martin, thank you. Now, who's training Colombia's torturers? Temas Teani, eye-opening dispatch from the heart of the Colombian jumble. Martin, just remind us, what is going on in Colombia? Who is ruling?
Well, President Santos is currently ruling Colombia, an elected president, but the elections are not entirely free and fair, in the sense that if you stand against, if you stand for radical parties, you end up dead before election day.
Okay,
there's been a fight going on between them and the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia for 50 years, but a negotiation is now going on between the two sides to try and bring a peace process about.
Okay, well, let's hear the final part of Temas Teani's report from the heart of the Colombian jungle.
The Chinese government have bought the rivers there. Sadly, there's a bit of collateral because there are Indians and indigenous who live in this river, on these river basins. But obviously, the Colombian government have all the infrastructure, military infrastructure, to get rid of these pesky Indians who just happen to be on these on the land of the Chinese now. And they have 7 dams to be constructed. One has been constructed. In that construction, they found in the river basin gold. And obviously, because the China own the river, it's now... Actually, I don't think it was China, that company. It's a Spanish company. But because they own the river basin, that company now own that gold, even though it's Colombian heritage. There's another one that's now being passed. And just by these two alone, 80% of the fishing industry there in this great river has been destroyed. That the land, because you get this reservoir, you get the sun reflecting on the hills, and so the land is drying out. As well as drying out on the surface, it's being lubricated by the lake, so you're getting massive landslides. You're getting the land drying out. All the local indigenous crops in this area are failing. But that's all okay with big business, because they've already had a solution that's been in place for many years in a company called Bienestar. In Spanish, that means well-being. It happens to be a sister company of Monsanto, which in the Latin you could say is My Saint. So My Saint and Well-being have come into Colombia, and they're offering their seeds, they're offering agricultural expertise to the Colombian and the country folk and the farmers who've been doing this for thousands of years. They've come there with the solutions, and it's very strange when you see how far back these rivers were sold. When the civil war began in Colombia against the guerrilla forces after the assassination of Gaitan in 1948, there's been a governmental policy in Colombia of aiming their own weapons, well, not their weapons, it's US weapons, at the Colombian people. And for all that time, the Colombian people have been the target of this civil war campaign, because a guerrilla is not going to go around wearing a badge saying, I'm a part of, the revolutionary guerrilla forces. That guerrilla is obviously going to try and look like a civilian. And for that reason, basically the Colombian people themselves, for the last 65 years, have been the enemy of the state. Have had their guns pointed at them. You go there as a tourist nowadays, the government, the army, better said, will pull a bus over, they'll have guns at everyone, and you as a tourist will walk off the bus, and suddenly they'll put the gun down, they'll have a smile, ask you if you're a tourist. Even though I'm not, I say yes, and they're like, great, good, you're a tourist, good. And then with their own people, they're trained to look at their own people like the enemy. And obviously after 60 years of this, and this is many generations, the people themselves have been trained just to be the suspect. So in terms of, there is no recent development of this, that this a system of control has been going on for 60 years. And really what's been going on there, everything I've described, is what's happened here in Great Britain centuries ago, with even before the Civil War, with the witch hunts and everything leading up to that. What we're seeing there is kind of what happened here many centuries ago. They've gotten a bit better at this process and can do it a lot faster and better technology to do it. The United States, we know, are supplying the weapons. And that is obvious. You go there and you can see on all the army people there what it says. And there's a documentary out that I recommend everyone who's interested in this subject to watch. It's called Impunity. This documentary is specifically talking about the paramilitary forces there And I believe in this documentary you can see that, and there it explains very clearly who does the training there. Israel send some of their best recruits, their best trainers to go there and to teach the paramilitary forces how to torture, how to get up confessions, and really it goes a lot more beyond that.
If people want to find out more about Colombia, is there a good place that people can go to online, or are there good bits of history books? And you obviously learnt a lot from the people you've been staying with, but I mean, where's a good place to start?
Well, this documentary I mentioned earlier called Impunity, which is the story of the paramilitary death squads. I'm not sure if it's in English subtitles just yet, but I recommend this documentary for everyone to have it copied, to have it shown. It's not necessarily one you want to see before going to bed. You want to be seeing it. It's better to see this and have a bit of time to digest it, because it does show very graphic images, and it does show the situation that's gone on there, and that explains very well the plight of just the everyday Colombian person there, and why the tourist industry has not flourished there in Colombia.
No, it does seem as if Latin America's had a pretty hard time ever since really the Second World War. I mean, we know, don't we, that there were Nazi rallies going on in Argentina during the war.
That's right, there is a big contingent there and a big connection between the fascism that came up in Chile and Argentina, and also the introduction or the fleeing of Nazi war criminals to South America. But you have to remember that also Nazi war criminals were invited to North America as well. And you have to also remember that the same North America are the ones that funded these regimes in South America. But there are certain anomalies there and certain things that don't make sense. For instance, one of the biggest places is Porto Alegre in Brazil, which has an amazing amount of Nazis that have gone there. And it's also one of the most highly developed, ecological, sustainable towns on the earth. So there is a certain amount of anomalies there, things that don't really fit in to our perception of what we understand of history. And they're very much the agenda there with UNESCO, that is that the earth is more important than the human being. I mean, obviously the earth is bigger than the human being, it has more, without the earth we cannot exist. But the idea that we ourselves can kick another human being down in order to save the earth, we are seriously misunderstanding what it is to live as brothers and sisters on this planet, and not putting each other down just because our idea might be better than someone else's idea. We all have the right to live on this earth in peace.
Temas Teani there from the heart of the Colombian jungle, just back about 2 weeks ago. Time to sign off now. Next up is Cyrus the Virus, the typical topical Afro-tropical show. Thanks very much to our guest in the first hour, Bristol's Cabinet Member for Children, Young People and Education, and Labour Councillor for Southmead, Brenda Massey. Also to Will Stone from Avon and Bristol Law Centre and local author on the effects of depleted uranium, Joanne Baker. Thanks also, of course, to our old Labour Oxford economist, Martin Summers. Thisweek.org.uk takes you straight to this show and our archives, and you can follow me on Twitter at Tony Gosling. And don't let the banksters get you down. See you next week.
Mobile. BCFM is an award-winning community radio station for Bristol, bringing you national news on the hour. Live from the Sky News Centre.